The world's economies are in turmoil. Trump, making good on his threat of tariffs, has thrown everything out of whack. Even if he were to rescind everything overnight, and I should stress, at the time of recording, he hasn't done that, you never know with Trump, but even if he did withdraw all his tariffs, would that mean business as usual? Or has he already changed international trade for good? Senior ministers have called it the end of the globalization era. So what would that mean for nations, for industries, for businesses and individuals? Let's remind ourselves of just what tariffs Trump has put in place with our correspondent, Alex Barker.
Thanks, Nick. Well, this all kicked off when President Trump announced a baseline of 10% on all imported goods, which came into effect on April the 5th. So companies in America which import goods from outside the US have to pay 10% tax to the US government. Now, countries including the UK and Turkey only incur that baseline 10%, though Nick, as you said, anything can happen. This is the case at time of recording. But Trump did put higher tariffs on goods from some other trading partners, which came into effect on April the 9th.
These include 20% for the European Union, 30% for South Africa, though these have been paused for 90 days. Not paused, though, is China's tariff, which was 54%, but Trump increased to over 100%. All this is in addition to the 25% tariffs he'd already announced for imports from Canada and Mexico.
On top of all that, if you're still with me, Trump also announced a 25% tariff on all car imports. Now, bear in mind, this is just what the US has brought in. We haven't even got into the countries retaliating with their own tariffs against the US. So all this is just pushing prices up, and discouraging international trade.
Thank you, Alex. Well, let's look at the impact all this is having now with economist Liam Halligan. Liam, welcome to Westminster Watch. Now, in your article of the 4th of April, you wrote that in all the chaos of Donald Trump's tariffs, there is actually the slim possibility that we could end up with lots of trade deals being done and actually a more liberal globalization program of trade in place. How come?
Yeah, I think for all the market turmoil that we're seeing, I do think there's a plan there, and at least the slim possibility, as I wrote in my When the Facts Change Substack on April the 4th, this is either madness or genius. It's too early to tell. Certainly the plan is, and this has been well laid out by people like Steve Mirren, the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, and US Treasury Secretary Bessent, the plan is to use these tariffs in order to lever other countries who have been levying tariffs on US goods sold abroad for many, many years, and there have been high tariffs on US goods, to try and lever them to lower their trade barriers, so there's lower trade barriers overall.
But there would be a lot of pain, because I suspect they're not all going to come to the negotiating table and get deals very quickly. There could be a lot of pain for American consumers and American businesses, couldn't there?
There could indeed be a lot of pain, but Trump is calculating, whether he's right or not, it's too early to tell. Trump's calculating that the pain on those countries, China for instance, which sells America 5 times more in value than America sells to China when it comes to goods, the pain will be greater for those trading partners levying tariffs on the US, and that the US consumers will take a bit of pain for a while if they see tangible results in terms of trade deals which leave the US better off overall. Look, it's massively audacious. You know, people said that former Prime Minister Liz Truss back in the day didn't prepare the ground for what she was going to do. Donald Trump hasn't prepared the ground at all. Not at all.
Well, hasn't he? Because interestingly, the way the stock markets are reacting, and every day it's different, but these changes, not the detail, but the principle behind raising tariffs pretty much across the world, That was telegraphed by Trump for months.
It was, but the stock markets didn't appreciate the extent to which he was going to levy tariffs. A baseline tariff of 10%, reciprocal tariffs of 20, 30, 40% on some of the world's biggest economies.
We are effectively in a trade war, but that trade war is currently financed by the Chinese, who could presumably sell off their debt and make.
They're not going to
life
sell it all
difficult.
off at once, because they would then themselves incur massive financial losses on their holdings, their hundreds of billions of dollars of US treasuries that they hold. But if they put the rumour around financial markets that they're going to go short, if you like, they're going to start selling off their US treasuries systematically,
Okay.
That's going to make life really difficult for the White House. And indeed, those higher borrowing costs will ripple across the Western world, including here in the UK.
Okay, now, when you talked about stocks and shares, why should that matter to people on Main Street, as the Americans would say, or the high streets in Britain?
Because even though the majority of stocks and shares are owned by very, very wealthy Americans, what characterises American society is a high exposure, even across lower middle class Americans, to stocks and shares. Americans have their pension plans, the so-called 401ks, that are heavily exposed to stocks and shares. So in America, far more than here in Europe, stocks and shares, stock prices, where the Dow Jones index or something is much more a subject of regular conversation. It's much more a part of mainstream news coverage than it is here in Europe. And so Trump will be exposed. Stocks and shares start falling. Middle America, even those that voted for Trump, and of course they voted for Trump in large numbers, he won the popular vote, he won both houses of Congress, they're going to start thinking, hey, my lifetime savings are being thwarted here. Hey, I might not be able to retire next year as I wanted to. Does the president really know what he's doing? And you can see the kind of MAGA alliance breaking up. There are signs that Elon Musk, who's of course owned Tesla exports, are going to be hammered by this retaliation, is starting to have his doubts. Some of the hedge fund billionaires that backed Trump, backed the MAGA movement, are now saying maybe he's gone too far. Maybe he needed to, as they say, roll the pitch, prepare the ground more before he does this.
You're a brave person to start anticipating what may or may not happen. Now, we're running out of time. I've got a very final question for you, if I may. Polling suggests, in Britain anyway, that actually Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, should be tougher in his response. Do you think he's actually doing the right thing, trying to have this, as he would say, cool and calm response to tariffs?
I don't think he's got a choice. Look, I do think there's a genuine possibility out of all this madness, as long as the markets don't blow up completely and Trump is forced kicking and screaming into a massive reversal, I do think there's at least a chance that out of this process you could see some trade deals cut in order to lower tariffs on both sides, not least between the US and the UK. And if Keir Starmer manages to do that, that would be a major feather in his cap. That would be a major political achievement.
Liam Halligan, thanks very much indeed for joining us here on the sofa of Westminster Watch. Joining me now is General Secretary for the International Chamber of Commerce, Chris Southworth, former Business and Trade Secretary, Sir Vince Cable, and former British diplomat, Andrew Levi. Welcome to Westminster Watch, gentlemen. And before I ask you even a single question, let's hear from the man of the hour, Donald Trump.
I'm telling you, these countries are calling us up, kissing my They are dying to make a deal. Please, sir, make a deal. I'll do anything, sir.
Donald Trump, in his usual characteristic style there, Andrew, talking to an audience about his tariffs, of course, which is what we're talking about today. He basically went on to say, I know what I'm doing. Do you know what the purpose is behind his tariff policy?
If there is a purpose, it's to try to get a better deal for the US, more power for the US in the world, without having to make alliances and depend on others for US security and US economic development. This seems to me to be a mirage, an impossible objective. And in fact, the US has had the best deal and continues to have the best deal. It has had enormous growth, enormous increase in prosperity over 80 years. From 50% admittedly of world GDP in 1950 down to around 25% now in 2025. So others have come up relatively, but the US prosperity has increased hugely during that time. There's been no war, that has affected the US. The US has gone out and fought some wars, but nothing's come to US territory apart from 9/11, when, guess what, NATO partners activated the Article 5 of the NATO treaty and helped the US. What better deal do you want than that? The US isn't being ripped off, as Donald Trump likes to say, and I think he's in danger of destroying the US's decades of prosperity.
Chris, he's taking on the world, basically, when it comes to tariffs. And he said there might be a little bit of pain. Does that pain mean recession's coming, do you think?
I think what the US behind a lot of this is a challenge to the global trading system. He is right that there isn't really a level playing field in some parts of the system. The difference is the tariffs are not the right solution. The way we fix those inequalities or imbalances are through international dialogue at multilateral level at the World Trade Organization. That's one point to make.
But they take years, don't they?
Well, we've got to do this as a global community because the world economy is different today than it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. But also, the US is only 13% of the global economy, global trade economy. So it's not the power it was. It doesn't have the power to dismantle the system, but it does have the power to disrupt everybody. The most important aspect of all of this is how the rest of the world respond, and there's a huge role for the UK to play in that conversation.
Vince, what should the UK's response be, do you think, to what is, all right, some say as relatively generous levels of tariffs on the UK, but what should it be?
Well, they're not relatively generous because Trump is trying to be kind to the UK. We're on the same tariff level as Russia, Iran, Honduras, Gabon. I mean, it's completely mad. And this is part of the problem. I mean, we're dealing with, somebody who would once have been called the leader of the free world, who is mad, bad, and dangerous. But as we've seen recently, Trump's behaviour towards China is exactly calculated not to produce an agreement. I mean, the Chinese are not going to grovel in the way that other countries, I'm afraid, including ours, are doing. And it's very difficult to see how they could reach this kind of grand bargain over fundamental imbalances.
Andrew, very quickly on this one. He's taking on most of the world, but he's taking on China. That's not going to end well, is it?
China is a problem. China is led by the Chinese Communist Party, and that is not a particularly pleasant organisation, but one that we want to be particularly close to. And I think we have made a generational error, starting with the US, but certainly including UK and the EU, in facilitating the rise of Chinese Communist Party power in the world. So there is something to be done there. This tariff policy is both inappropriate in terms of solving the problem, but also if you're trying to get from A to B, A is not where you want to be and B is somewhere better. To get there, you mustn't be killed on the way, And so this is a real problem. It's like a bull in a china shop.
People are worried about tariffs. That's not a word politicians would have necessarily, or not a thought politicians would necessarily have had, that people on the streets would be talking about this issue and concerned about it. We went out onto those streets. Let's take a look at what some people are thinking and saying about the threat, or the implementation of these tariffs.
What do you think of President Trump's tariffs?
Absolute nightmare, total catastrophe, but what can you do?
And why is that?
Well, as the layman in the street, I have very little power, just like anybody else, and you're kind of at the behest of a lunatic.
Well, it's going to cause the biggest recession around the world, I'm sure of it.
They're a threat to the world economy, potential recession, so that's my concern from a personal perspective.
I understand what he's getting at, but I think it's too much, too soon, too quickly, and it hasn't been thought out.
I think it shows that he's out of control, doesn't necessarily have any regard for the well-being of others.
What should the UK do?
Sit tight, hopefully it'll all blow over. That's what I'm hoping anyway.
I've got to balance the situation, just because you don't particularly want to anger him, because it seems that every time somebody does, he's raising the tariffs even more. So I do think it's a delicate situation.
I'm not sure whether it's feasible, but potentially consider trading with other people that doesn't include the US.
Yeah, trying to sort of lean on this so-called special relationship might be our only sort of hope of getting something out of it.
What's your reaction to that? And particularly on the point, people are clearly worried, but they're saying, yeah, let's stay calm. Is that how business should react?
Well, the first thing is a tariff is an import tax on US consumers. So when the president was setting out the tariff schedule in the Rose Garden of the White House, what he should have been saying is this is the price hikes you're going to feel in the shops, from everything from fruit to vegetables to computers, cars, phones. That's all going to hit US consumers this week, next week, week after. From a business point of view, obviously this is more disruption. We've had 10 years of disruption. It's more risk, but there's also an awful lot of opportunity to refocus our trade strategy, which is due in May. We should certainly be ramping up trade into places like Latin America, which we undertrade to. Africa, the same, is going to be the next biggest consumer market in the next 10, 20 years.
Not easy to do, though, is it? You're not going to do that overnight.
Well,
there's going to be a lot of pain.
For some, no. Others, it's quicker. And I think we'll see a lot more of that rerouting of trade. We're already starting to see some of it take place, even with the bigger companies. So businesses will adapt. They always do. And they'll always find a better route. And for the UK, we have to focus on our own priorities, which is, number one, growth.
Vince, notwithstanding all of that, which I'm sure you don't disagree with, the reality is Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, was saying at the weekend, or he was suggesting, it was being briefed, globalisation is dead. The trade has changed forever in the world. Do you agree with that?
No, I don't. I mean, there is a very
But we're
high
going for the biggest protectionist
Well, trade is
move.
one aspect of what people call globalisation, and there certainly has been a move in America, not everywhere else, to put up barriers to trade, and also there are barriers to migration, but capital flows are still very, very substantial. A global digital economy is becoming much more integrated. I mean, you send messages all over the world within a split second, and that process is not going to end. But your question originally was about what we do in the UK, and we're not a big player anymore. I mean, we've got to be realistic about it, and we've got to work with like-minded countries. That's Canada, the European Union, countries in Asia, Japan, South Korea. We are members, I think by accident as much as anything else, of something called the CGTPP, which is a kind of Asian-Pacific free trade area. The Chinese will probably join and should. And if we work in that context, we can avoid some of the damage which Trump himself is doing. But in negotiations with him, just remember your introductory interview with Trump, the utter contempt he has for his so-called allies, the people who are trying to act as supplicants. He just despises people like
So,
that.
Andrew, let me take that point up with you. What will diplomats be saying to each other? What advice will they be giving? How will they be trying to get those negotiations that it seems Donald Trump is now saying, hey, come along, and do a deal with us as long as it's favourable to me? How are they going to deal with this?
I think it's an extraordinarily difficult situation. Obviously, if Trump goes down the path that he's implying, there's almost nothing one can do except try to defend ourselves, try to grow our economies without causing excessive inflation, try to increase our defence capabilities. But the US is the linchpin of our defence capabilities in Europe, also for Japan and other parts of the world. You can't replace that for the next 10 years. It's not going to work. So we'll be defenceless if we don't have a really good relationship with the USA.
The government do you think, to put UK business at the very least at ease that they have got their backs, which is what the Prime Minister keeps saying?
Well, I think, the government's doing the right thing. We need to be calm, not overreact, not retaliate.
Hasn't worked so far. 25% on cars, still got a 10% tariff.
Well, it could be a lot worse. It's certainly a lot worse in other parts of the country. It's definitely going to hurt UK business. There's no getting away from it because our global supply chains are connected all over the world and with the US. So it's going to take time. It's going to be painful, but I think the number one priority right now, like I said, is growth. We have to focus on growth. You can't grow without trade. So now's the time to really digitalise and modernise our trading system, get rid of all the friction and reduce the risk and cost for business. And that goes some way to mitigating the obviously incoming costs from US tariffs. But it also drives up the headroom for the UK government, which they desperately need so that we're more resilient.
So that sounds like you're saying there's an opportunity here for the UK government to take the lead. But perhaps I can put this to you, Vince. Post-Brexit, America was the great opportunity. It was sold that this is the country we should be doing business with as we broke away from the European Union. Is the answer likely to be of Keir Starmer's government not just to seize some of the liberalisation that's been talked about, but to actually even consider rejoining the single market?
Yes, I think so.
Do you think they will?
Or the customs union. For a very simple reason. I mean, our trade with the European Union as a whole is significantly more important than our trade with the United States. When the idea of a trade deal with the US was always oversold.
But it sounds more prospects
it's
now.
useful. You know, if you get a good agreement, fine. But you know, there are problems with it. I mean, one of the things I would worry about most is the thing which has already been advertised, that we abandoned the digital tax, which actually is perfectly sensible in the UK and providing an offset.
But that would pale into insignificance if you were to rejoin of some form, a customs union or single market of the EU.
Yes.
You'd also be signing up to an institution Trump hates.
Well, I think we've just got to get used to the idea we've got to stand up to Trump, not just kowtow at every juncture. No, I think we are going to have to re-engage with the European Union. The signs are so far not very encouraging. Starmer turned up his nose at a very limited youth mobility scheme, which would have sent good vibes and would have been of some advantage to young people, just were not even willing to take that risk. So the chances of the British government negotiating anything that is really radical are currently not great. I mean, I think I would agree with the comment we just had that we need to have sensible domestic policies, and that is actually been somewhat more business friendly than the government currently is.
Let's talk about those domestic policies, if I may, for a minute. And Andrew, just ask you this. Is this an opportunity for Keir Starmer now to say, we've had a world shock, a bit like with the Tories in power, they had COVID. They ditched every pledge possible, spent more than anyone would have said a Conservative government did. Do you think that this is actually where Keir Starmer might go? Say, whole reset now, I'm going to have lots of new policies, whether it's liberalising business, whether it's seeking new opportunities, joining the single market again. Do you think that would be the right thing to do? Do you think he's got the, if you like, the political courage to do something like that, as some would say?
So I think ditching the fiscal rules and rejoining the single market and customs union are indeed pretty much essential. The politics of it is very hard. I think he thinks it's very difficult. He's looking at constituencies, many constituencies where reform is in second place, and Morgan McSweeney, his chief of staff and election guru, is looking sort of micro-targeting those constituencies one by one. What do you do when you're micro-targeting constituencies where people might vote reform? You look at policies which might attract reform voters. That's a big tension in what he needs to do and what he's perhaps more likely to do. I think he's got a massive geopolitical and security problem that he's also trying to deal with. Standing up to Trump, as we've said, is all very well, but the UK is particularly closely intertwined with the USA. We know about the intelligence relationship. People often talk about that. It's even more intertwined than most people think. Former cabinet ministers will know how intertwined it is. But also, we're intertwined in Vince Cable's old role as business secretary. We're heavily intertwined on inward investment. It's huge inward investment both ways, from the US into the UK and the UK into the US.
So it's a complex picture. But do you think this is actually, going back to the main point about Keir Starmer ditching the baggage, briefly, do you think that is something he'll get away with if he did it? Because the British public, as we've heard from the voiceovers, are very worried. British business wants some certainty. Is this the moment for Keir Starmer to dip his pledges and actually look at rejoining single market, breaking the fiscal rules?
Well, I wouldn't advocate for joining the single market at this point in time. I don't think we're politically ready as a country, but I think this is the moment to reset. And I would absolutely support his recent call. All bets off, all assumptions off. We need to look at every single option to increase our trade and make life easier for business. That will go down well with business.
Isn't that code, what Chris just alluded to, that the Prime Minister said, that's code for him basically doing a big reset with the EU? And do you think politically he can get that through if he wanted it?
Well, yes and no. It certainly should, but probably can't. But the big reset...
He's got a big majority.
I think the big reset which has to be done is looking at the commitments which the Labour Party made before the last election on taxation, which are absolutely absurd.
More tax?
I'm afraid that is inevitable. And
more borrowing?
The idea... Well, more borrowing, which is what you have to do if the economy turns down. But certainly the tax issue is potentially very difficult. They made these commitments. They weren't going to raise rates of tax on 80% of our fiscal base, which is absolutely bonkers. But you do these things in opposition. All parties have done it. And if the economy goes the way it looks, to maintain their fiscal credibility, they are going to have to raise some basic taxes.
Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us here. I have a feeling that this is going to evolve and change, not over the weeks, but over the hours. But thank you for joining us here on Westminster Watch. And indeed, thanks again to all my guests for joining me. And don't forget to connect with us on X at Westminster TRT. But for now, from me and all the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.